The people who have the least are often the last ones still willing to share. The bell above the diner door gave a tired little chime just as the snow began falling harder, and for a moment every conversation inside faded beneath the sound of the wind pressing against the windows. Daniel Brooks looked down at the paper tray in front of him. One chicken sandwich, one bowl of tomato soup, two plastic cups filled with water. It was all he could afford until payday on Friday, and Friday still felt painfully far away. Across from him, 8-year-old Sophie smiled anyway, peeling the wrapper from a packet of crackers as though it were the best dinner in Chicago. She had inherited that smile from her mother, the kind that somehow made small things feel enough. Daniel forced one back. Even though he knew she had noticed, he had quietly pushed most of the sandwich toward her side of the table. "Daddy, you forgot your half," she whispered. "I'm not that hungry tonight," he answered with the practiced ease of a father who had been telling the same harmless lie for years. Sophie looked at him for another second, but didn't argue. She simply broke one cracker in half and slid the larger piece toward him without saying a word. Before Daniel could thank her, the diner door opened again. A woman stepped inside, pulling a threadbare gray coat tightly around herself. Snow clung to her dark hair, melting slowly against her cheeks. She looked exhausted, not just tired from walking but worn down in a way that reached deeper than cold weather. Her gloves didn't match. Her boots carried slush across the floor. Several customers glanced up before returning to their meals almost immediately, the silent way people often dismissed someone they had already decided didn't belong. The woman approached the counter with a handful of coins resting in her palm. "Could I please have the soup?" she asked quietly. The cashier counted the change twice before shaking his head with an apologetic sigh. "You're $2 short, ma'am." She nodded as though she had expected the answer. "What about just some hot water?" The cashier hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but before he could answer, a man wearing an expensive wool coat stood and smiled broadly while raising his phone. "I'll buy your dinner," he announced loudly. "Mind if I record it? My followers love random acts of kindness." The woman stared at the phone for only a second before lowering her eyes. "No, thank you." The man shrugged, slipped his phone back into his pocket, and returned to his table, muttering that some people didn't appreciate generosity. Nobody else moved. Nobody invited her to sit. Nobody even asked if she was warm enough. Daniel watched the woman turn toward the door again, preparing to step back into the snow with empty hands. His fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. He knew exactly how much that sandwich mattered tonight. He knew tomorrow morning Sophie would ask for breakfast before school, and there was almost nothing left at home besides cereal crumbs and half a gallon of milk. He also knew what Rachel would have done. Even 3 years after cancer had stolen his wife, her quiet voice still found him during moments like this. Kindness doesn't wait until life becomes convenient, Daniel. Sophie followed his gaze toward the woman standing alone near the entrance. She looked back at the sandwich, then at her father. Without hesitation, she picked it up, broke it neatly in half, and placed the larger piece on a napkin. "Daddy," she said softly, "Mom used to say food is supposed to make people feel safe." Daniel swallowed hard. Around them, forks scraped against plates, coffee cups clinked softly, and outside the wind rattled the windows harder than before. A man at the next booth leaned over just enough to whisper, "Don't give away your kids' dinner. People like that always come back asking for more." Daniel looked at him with calm eyes, then stood, lifted the napkin holding half the sandwich, and carried it toward the woman without the slightest trace of hesitation. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Would you join us? There's plenty of room at our table." The woman stared at him in complete silence, as though she had forgotten what it felt like to be invited anywhere. Neither Daniel nor Sophie knew that before sunrise the woman standing in front of them would return to a world of private jets, boardrooms, and billion-dollar decisions. They only saw someone who looked cold, hungry, and completely alone. The woman hesitated for several long seconds before accepting the empty chair across from Daniel and Sophie, almost as though she had forgotten what it felt like to sit at a table where nobody expected anything from her. Daniel slid the bowl of tomato soup toward the center so all three of them could reach it. Sophie carefully placed the larger half of the sandwich in front of the stranger before taking the smaller piece for herself without the slightest complaint. The woman looked at the food, then back at the father and daughter. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Daniel smiled with the calm confidence of someone who had learned that dignity could survive even when money did not. Food does not become more valuable because one person keeps all of it, he replied. For the first time that day, the woman allowed herself to smile, although it lasted only a moment before emotion threatened to replace it. She thanked them softly and lifted the spoon with hands that still trembled from the cold. The warmth seemed to return to her slowly, one careful bite at a time. Sophie watched with innocent curiosity instead of suspicion. "My name is Sophie," she said. "This is my dad, Daniel." The woman paused before answering. "You can call me Evelyn." She did not offer a last name. Daniel did not ask for one. Outside, the snow continued to pile against parked cars, turning the busy Chicago street into a quiet sheet of white. Inside, the little diner felt strangely removed from the rest of the city. For several minutes, they simply shared dinner without filling every silence. Daniel understood that some people carried burdens they were not ready to explain. Evelyn found herself studying the father across from her. His work jacket carried the familiar Whitmore Foods logo stitched above the pocket, faded from years of washing. The sight caught her completely off guard. Thousands of employees wore that logo every day, but she had never actually shared a meal with one of them. "Long shift?" she finally asked. Daniel nodded. "Warehouse distribution. On the south side. Night shift this week." "Do you like working there?" she asked carefully. Daniel considered the question before answering. "The people are good. Most of them are trying to support families just like me. The job is honest. Sometimes the decisions made above us are harder to understand than the work itself." Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the soup. "What kind of decisions?" Daniel shrugged gently. "Rumors mostly. People keep talking about closing our distribution center. Nobody tells us much. We just hear things. Folks start wondering how they are going to pay rent if the rumors become real." Sophie quietly reached for another cracker and split it into 3 equal pieces before anyone noticed. She placed one beside Daniel, one beside Evelyn, and kept the last one herself. Evelyn watched the little ritual with unexpected admiration. No speeches, no performance, just habit. She realized kindness seemed to be the language this family spoke every day. "My mom used to say sharing makes food taste better," Sophie explained. Daniel smiled at his daughter before looking back toward Evelyn. Rachel believed nobody should have to earn compassion first. Hearing his late wife's name still carried a softness that time had never erased. Evelyn noticed the wedding ring still resting on Daniel's finger, worn smooth around the edges from years of work. She wanted to ask about Rachel, but sensed the question belonged to another day. Instead, she glanced toward the snow outside. "Your daughter must be cold walking home in weather like this." Daniel laughed quietly. "She tells me she is tougher than Chicago winters." Sophie grinned proudly. "I have 2 coats at home. Dad only has 1. Daniel shook his head with amused embarrassment while Evelyn quietly absorbed every detail. The little girl was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling the truth. That honesty somehow carried more weight than every polished presentation Evelyn had heard inside corporate boardrooms. As Daniel reached for his cup of water, a folded envelope slipped halfway out of his jacket pocket. Before he tucked it back inside, Evelyn caught just enough of the bold print to read the words "Final Notice." Daniel noticed her glance and calmly slid the paper away. "Nothing important," he said, though his voice carried the gentle exhaustion of someone trying to protect a child from worries far too heavy for 8 years old. Evelyn did not challenge him. She only looked at the faded company logo on his jacket once more and felt an unfamiliar ache settle quietly in her chest. For the first time in many years, the distance between the executive office and the warehouse floor no longer measured itself in miles. It measured itself in one shared bowl of soup, one broken sandwich, and one family that had almost nothing, yet somehow still believed there was enough to share. When the last spoonful of tomato soup disappeared, nobody reached for the tray. The diner had begun settling into closing time, with chairs turning upside down on tables and the overhead lights dimming one row at a time. Yet the small booth by the window still felt separate from the rest of the room. Daniel folded the sandwich wrapper into a neat square and placed it beneath the empty bowl. Sophie copied him with her cracker packet, smoothing the paper carefully before setting it beside his. Evelyn watched them with an attention she could not explain. Neither gesture mattered in any measurable way, Yet both revealed a kind of order she rarely saw in rooms where entire divisions were reduced to colored charts. "How old are you, Sophie?" she asked. "8," Sophie answered. "9 in the spring. And what do you want to be when you grow up?" Sophie considered the question with surprising seriousness before looking at Daniel. "Someone people can call when they are scared." Daniel smiled, but a shadow passed through his expression. "That is a very big job." "You do it," Sophie said simply. Evelyn looked down at the blue Whitmore Foods logo stitched above Daniel's jacket pocket. For one brief second, her hand moved as though she meant to straighten it, the same unconscious gesture she made before company photographs, but she stopped herself and curled her fingers around the edge of the table instead. Daniel noticed nothing. He was helping Sophie zip the inner lining of her coat. "What kind of work do you do at the warehouse?" Evelyn asked. "Shipping coordination," he replied. "Mostly making sure the stores receive what they ordered before something spoils or a truck sits too long. Refrigerated loads lose more margin during dock delays than they do during transit," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. Daniel glanced at her with mild surprise. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the empty bowl. "I used to know someone who worked in distribution," she added. Daniel accepted the answer without suspicion. "Then you know the schedule looks simple until weather, traffic, and broken equipment all decide to argue at the same time." His tone held no self-pity, only the quiet confidence of a man who understood his work and did it well. Evelyn found herself wondering how many times his solutions had protected profits that executives later praised without ever learning his name. Earlier that afternoon, she had stood outside a Whitmore Foods market less than 2 miles away and asked a customer whether the nearest warming center was still open. The woman had heard her. Evelyn knew because their eyes had met. Yet the customer had tightened her grip on 2 grocery bags and hurried toward a waiting car. At the downtown hotel where Evelyn had once hosted a charity dinner, the doorman had stepped between her and the revolving door with practiced courtesy. He had not insulted her. He had only told her the lobby was reserved for guests. At a convenience store, a man had placed 3 quarters in her palm without pausing long enough to hear that she needed directions, not money. None of them had seemed cruel. That was what disturbed her most. They had dismissed her so naturally that forgetting her required no effort. Daniel, however, had noticed the moment she stopped moving near the diner door. Sophie had noticed even sooner. "Are you cold again?" Sophie asked. Evelyn realized the child was holding out the remaining half of her napkin, folded into a tiny square. "You can wrap it around the cup," Sophie explained. "It keeps your fingers from touching the cold part." Evelyn accepted it as though it were something precious. "Thank you." Sophie nodded and leaned against Daniel's arm, satisfied that the problem had been solved. The simplicity of it left Evelyn almost ashamed. This family did not discuss compassion as an idea. They practiced it before deciding whether it was convenient. Outside, snow pressed harder against the glass. A city bus passed slowly, its tires cutting dark lines through the white street before disappearing beyond the corner. The cashier switched off the sign above the counter. Daniel rose and helped Sophie into her coat, then reached for his own. Evelyn remained seated for 1 second too long. She had planned to return to her life before midnight, but the storm had broken the route she intended to follow, and pride had kept her from using the emergency number hidden inside her coat. Daniel studied her quietly. He did not demand an explanation or ask what mistake had brought her there. His voice remained calm, respectful, and free of judgment. "Evelyn," he said, "do you have somewhere safe to sleep tonight?" Daniel held the diner door open as Sophie and Evelyn stepped into the storm. Wind swept snow across the sidewalk in fast white ribbons, erasing footprints almost as soon as they appeared. Sophie pulled her hood tight and slipped one hand into Daniel's. Evelyn wore the blue striped gloves Sophie had given her, holding them close to her chest as though warmth could be protected by will alone. Daniel stayed nearest the street, placing himself between Sophie and the slow line of passing cars without seeming to notice he was doing it. "The church on Madison is 3 blocks from here," he said. "They sometimes open the fellowship hall when the temperature drops this low." Evelyn nodded, though her attention had already shifted to the bright storefront across the intersection. A Whitmore Foods neighborhood market stood open beneath a glowing green sign. Inside, employees restocked shelves while customers hurried through checkout lines with bread, milk, and bottled water. A banner above the entrance promised community first. Evelyn felt her steps slow. She remembered approving that campaign during a 30-minute branding meeting. The words had looked convincing on a presentation screen. Standing outside in a borrowed coat, she wondered how many people believed them. Daniel noticed where she was looking. "That store gets busy before storms," he said. "Our warehouse probably sent 2 extra trucks today." "Refrigerated deliveries?" Evelyn asked before caution could stop her. Daniel nodded. "Mostly. Produce, dairy, prepared meals. Weather delays can ruin a schedule fast. Unless dispatch moves the priority loads to the earlier dock windows," she replied quietly. Daniel glanced at her, impressed but not suspicious. "You know more about distribution than most people." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I have heard people talk about it." Daniel accepted the explanation. He looked through the windows at the employees moving quickly beneath the fluorescent lights. The workers inside are doing everything they can. Most problems do not start with them. "Where do they start?" Evelyn asked. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "People upstairs make decisions from reports. Maybe the numbers look clean from where they sit. Down here, one changed route means somebody loses hours. One delayed contract means a family starts choosing which bill waits." His voice held no anger. That made the words harder for Evelyn to dismiss. She remembered a recent proposal to consolidate several warehouse routes, including the Southside facility where Daniel worked. The presentation had promised efficiency. Grant Caldwell had called the plan necessary discipline. Evelyn had approved the next stage of review without asking who would carry the cost if the numbers failed. Sophie tugged gently at Daniel's hand. "Daddy, are the people upstairs mean?" Daniel looked down at her. "No, sweetheart. Most people are not mean. Sometimes they are just too far away to see who gets hurt." Evelyn turned toward the store window before either of them could notice the shame crossing her face. Across the city, Grant Caldwell stood alone in a conference room high above downtown Chicago. Evelyn's security team had reported losing visual contact hours earlier. Grant listened without interrupting, then asked exactly when the last confirmed sighting had occurred. He did not sound worried. He sounded prepared. After ending the call, he opened a draft presentation labeled Executive Continuity. One slide questioned whether a chief executive officer who vanished during a personal experiment could still be trusted with urgent decisions. Another proposed temporary authority for senior leadership. Grant paused before the final slide, then closed the file without completing it. By morning, he would know how far he could move without appearing eager. Back on Madison Street, Daniel bought Evelyn a cup of hot water from a convenience store owner who remembered Daniel helping him change a flat tire the previous summer. Evelyn wrapped both gloved hands around the paper cup. No contract had required the favor. No camera recorded it. Kindness had simply traveled back to the person who had sent it forward. The church appeared at the end of the block, its porch light glowing through the snow. Sophie brightened. "We made it." Daniel smiled with cautious relief, but the expression faded as they came closer. Several families stood beneath the covered entrance with blankets pulled around their shoulders. A volunteer stepped outside, glanced at the waiting line, and slowly shook his head. Behind him, every chair in the fellowship hall was already occupied. Daniel stopped beside Evelyn as the volunteer approached with regret in his eyes. Before the man spoke, they all understood. The church was full. The volunteer stepped forward with genuine regret written across his face before speaking. "I am sorry. Every bed is already taken, and we have families waiting inside the fellowship hall. We cannot safely bring in anyone else tonight because the building is at capacity." His voice carried kindness instead of rejection, which somehow made the answer even harder to hear. Daniel nodded with understanding. "Thank you for trying." The volunteer looked toward Sophie, then quietly reached into a basket beside the entrance and handed her a small package of peanut butter crackers. "For the walk home," he said with a warm smile. Sophie accepted them politely, but did not open the package. Instead, she slipped it into her backpack without a word. As they stepped away from the church entrance, Evelyn looked at the line of people still hoping another space might somehow appear. She had funded charitable projects for years, yet she had never stood outside one waiting to discover there was simply no room left. The reality settled over her with a weight that no financial report had ever carried. Snow continued drifting down in slow, steady silence. Daniel glanced at the time on the old watch wrapped around his wrist. He knew he should already be heading home. Sophie had school the next morning, and his alarm would ring before sunrise for another shift at the warehouse. Even so, he could not bring himself to simply wish Evelyn good luck and disappear into the storm. "There is another warming center about a mile from here," he said thoughtfully. "I do not know if they have space, but it is worth checking." Evelyn immediately shook her head. "You have already done more than enough. Sophie needs to get home." Daniel looked down at his daughter. "What do you think?" Sophie answered without hesitation. "If we were lost, I would hope somebody would walk with us." Daniel smiled gently. "That settles it." Evelyn lowered her eyes. Almost embarrassed by the generosity she continued receiving from people who clearly had so little to spare. As they walked farther through the quiet neighborhood, they noticed an elderly man sitting alone beneath the awning of a closed laundromat. His coat was much too thin for the weather, and his hands were tucked beneath his arms as he tried to preserve whatever warmth remained. Daniel slowed his pace immediately. "Evening, Harold," he called softly. The older man looked up and managed a tired smile. "Looks like winter finally won," he replied. Daniel crouched beside him. "Have you eaten?" Harold shrugged with the kind of practiced dignity that refused to complain. "I will manage." Daniel knew that answer meant no. Before he could say anything else, Sophie quietly removed the unopened package of peanut butter crackers from her backpack and placed it into Harold's hands. "The church gave these to me," she said. "I think you need them more." Harold looked at the little girl for a long moment before accepting the small package with both hands. "Thank you," he whispered. "That is a mighty generous gift." Evelyn watched the exchange in complete silence. Sophie had not even considered keeping the crackers for herself. Sharing had become as natural to her as breathing because she had learned it by watching her father every single day. Harold smiled toward Daniel. "Rachel would be proud of both of you." Daniel's expression softened at the mention of his wife. "We miss her every day." Harold nodded slowly. "The good ones leave lessons behind that keep walking long after they are gone." Those words lingered in the cold air as the four of them continued down the sidewalk together. Evelyn found herself wondering how many people like Harold had quietly disappeared into statistics over the years while executives debated efficiency and cost reductions. She suddenly remembered approving a presentation only months earlier about restructuring several distribution routes. The discussion had centered on numbers, transportation costs, and quarterly performance. Nobody in the room had spoken about fathers, children, elderly workers, or neighborhoods where one lost paycheck could change an entire family's future. They finally reached the second warming center only to find another handwritten sign taped beside the entrance. "Full capacity. Please try again tomorrow." Evelyn stared at the words until they blurred. Tomorrow was a promise people with homes could afford to make. Tonight was all that mattered. Daniel looked around the nearly deserted street before quietly making a decision. "Our apartment is small," he said. "Very small. But it is warm, and nobody should spend a night outside in weather like this." Evelyn looked at him in complete disbelief. "Daniel, I cannot ask that of you." He shook his head gently. "You did not ask. We are offering." Sophie reached over and slipped her small hand into Evelyn's gloved hand with complete trust. "Come home with us," she said softly. "Mom always said a safe house gets warmer when kindness walks through the door." Daniel unlocked apartment 2B and stepped aside so Evelyn could enter before him. The apartment was small, but nothing inside felt neglected. A worn couch faced a narrow bookshelf crowded with children's novels, library books, and framed photographs. A paper snowflake hung in the front window, and a tiny artificial Christmas tree stood near the kitchen table with handmade ornaments leaning slightly to one side. Sophie hurried to place her backpack beside the door, then pointed toward a faded blue chair. "Do not sit there," she warned. "It wobbles." Daniel smiled as he removed his coat. "I have been meaning to fix it." Evelyn sat on the couch while Daniel filled a kettle in the kitchen. The room was warmer than the church entrance had been, yet she could still feel the cold trapped deep inside her hands. Daniel returned with a mug of chamomile tea. "It is all we have tonight," he said, "but it should help." "It is more than enough," Evelyn replied. Her eyes moved toward the photograph above the bookshelf. Daniel stood beside a smiling woman near Lake Michigan, with a much younger Sophie between them. "That is my mom," Sophie said, climbing onto the couch. Her name was Rachel. Daniel's expression softened. She could make an ordinary Saturday feel important. Sophie reached for a photo album, then paused when Daniel gently touched the cover. Another night, sweetheart. She nodded without protest and returned it to the table. Evelyn noticed the quiet understanding between them. Grief lived in the apartment, but it had not been allowed to turn the home bitter. On the kitchen counter, a stack of unopened envelopes sat arranged by size. Utility notices, a school letter, medical statements. Daniel followed Evelyn's glance without embarrassment. Some weeks you pay what cannot wait and ask the rest to be patient, he said. His tone carried no shame, only fact. Evelyn looked back at the photograph of Rachel, then at the Whitmore Foods jacket hanging beside the door. You said you coordinate shipping, she said. What does that involve? Daniel sat across from her at the kitchen table. Depends on the day. Truck appointments, store orders, refrigeration windows, late vendors. Mostly keeping one problem from becoming 5. How do you handle spoilage when inbound loads miss their dock time? Evelyn asked. Daniel leaned forward. Slightly. You do not wait for the missed window to become official. I track temperature-sensitive loads before they cross the county line, then move dry freight to later slots if the cold chain is at risk. The software only reacts after the delay. People on the floor usually see it coming first. Evelyn studied him more carefully. And outbound shortages? Cross-dock the highest demand items, split lower volume routes, and stop sending half-empty trailers just because the original schedule says they should leave. He paused. Last winter, I proposed combining 2 overnight routes and using 1 refrigerated trailer as a rolling buffer. It cut overtime and reduced waste for 6 weeks. What happened to the proposal? My supervisor liked it. Regional management said it was outside my role. Daniel smiled without resentment. So we kept doing it unofficially until somebody noticed the numbers improved. Evelyn felt a quiet shock. His solution was nearly identical to an optimization plan presented at headquarters by a consulting firm that had charged Whitmore Foods more than Daniel would earn in years. You understand the system better than many managers, she said. Daniel shrugged. I understand the people moving through it. That usually tells you where the system will break. On the counter, beneath one of the medical bills, Evelyn noticed a folded warehouse memo. Only a few lines were visible, but the phrase Caldwell Operational Review appeared near the bottom. She knew that language. Grant Caldwell's team had used it in the consolidation proposal that placed Daniel's facility at risk. She said nothing. Daniel had no idea that the woman drinking tea at his table had signed the review authorization after Grant assured her the plan would protect long-term stability. Sophie gave a small cough from the couch. Daniel turned immediately, but she waved one hand. Just the cold air, she said. He watched her for a moment before returning to the conversation. A minute later, she coughed again, softer this time, and rubbed the center of her chest. Daniel's attention shifted completely. Come sit closer to the heater, he said. Sophie obeyed, carrying her stuffed bear with her. Evelyn noticed Daniel did not panic. He listened. He watched the pace of Sophie's breathing, counted silently, and asked whether her throat felt tight or only dry. A little tight, Sophie admitted. Daniel reached into her backpack and removed the inhaler. He checked the label, shook it once, and handed it to her. Sophie pressed it, inhaled, then waited. For several seconds the room remained quiet except for the radiator ticking beside the wall. Her breathing eased, but not completely. Daniel took the inhaler back and tested its weight in his palm. His face stayed calm, though Evelyn saw concern settle behind his eyes. How many doses are left? She asked. There should be more, he said. Sophie looked down. I used it at school yesterday. Daniel nodded as if the information were simply another problem to solve. He checked the counter, opened a drawer for the pharmacy paperwork, then glanced at the clock. Snow still pressed against the window, and the wind had begun rattling the glass again. Sophie gave one more shallow cough. Daniel rose, reached for his warehouse jacket, and slipped it on. The pharmacy on Madison stays open all night, he said. We are going now. Sophie gave another quiet cough, and Daniel gently knelt beside her before placing the back of his hand against her forehead. She managed a reassuring smile that looked far braver than any 8-year-old should have needed to be. I am okay, Daddy, she whispered. It just feels a little tight. Daniel looked at the nearly empty inhaler once more before slipping it carefully into his pocket. We are not going to take chances, he said. The pharmacy on Madison stays open all night. We will be back before you know it. Evelyn immediately stood. I am coming with you. Daniel shook his head politely. You have already been out in this weather long enough. She answered with quiet determination. You opened your home to someone you did not know. The least I can do is walk beside you. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Minutes later, the three of them stepped back into the freezing night. The wind had grown even stronger, sweeping snow across the sidewalks in long white ribbons. Daniel held Sophie's hand firmly while Evelyn walked beside them, still wearing the blue striped gloves Sophie had given her. Every few steps, Daniel glanced down to check whether Sophie was breathing comfortably. He never asked if she was slowing him down. He simply adjusted his pace to match hers. The pharmacy's bright green sign finally appeared through the snowfall, glowing like a small promise against the dark sky. Inside, only one employee remained behind the counter, quietly organizing shelves before closing. Daniel walked directly to the prescription window and placed the nearly empty inhaler on the counter. "I need a refill for my daughter," he explained calmly. The pharmacist typed for a few moments before looking back with sympathy. "Your insurance renewal has not processed yet. The refill will be $126. Daniel nodded slowly, already knowing the answer before asking the next question. "Can I pay part tonight and the rest on Friday?" The pharmacist offered an apologetic smile. "I wish I could approve that, but the system will not allow it." Daniel lowered his eyes for just a second. He reached into his wallet and quietly counted every bill it contained. $20. A few singles. Some coins. Not even close. Sophie noticed immediately. "Daddy," she said softly, "I can wait until tomorrow." Daniel looked at her with gentle firmness. Breathing does not wait until tomorrow. Evelyn felt an overwhelming urge to tell the pharmacist exactly who she was. One phone call could solve everything within minutes. One sentence could bring security, transportation, warmth, and every resource she had spent a lifetime building. But she remembered the agreement she had made before beginning this day. No name, no position, no privilege. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat instead. Hidden beneath the lining was a simple gold ring she had removed that morning before leaving her office. It was the only valuable item she still carried because she had forgotten it was sewn into a small emergency compartment. She carefully placed it on the counter. "Please," she said, "keep this until I come back. It is worth much more than the medicine." The pharmacist stared at the ring in surprise, but slowly pushed it back toward her. "I cannot accept expensive jewelry as collateral. Store policy does not allow it." Evelyn's heart sank. Daniel quietly slid the ring back into her hand before speaking in the same calm voice he had used all evening. "Thank you anyway. I understand." There was no anger, no raised voice, only disappointment wrapped in quiet dignity. As they turned toward the exit, the pharmacist suddenly called after them. "Wait." He disappeared into a small office for a moment before returning with a plain white paper bag. "This is a manufacturer emergency sample. I only have one left, and I am supposed to reserve it for unusual situations." He looked directly at Sophie and smiled gently. "Tonight feels like one of those situations." Daniel stood speechless for a moment before accepting the bag with both hands. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I will make sure the refill is paid for as soon as I can." The pharmacist nodded. "Just take care of your little girl." Outside the pharmacy, Sophie used the new inhaler and took a slow, comfortable breath. The relief on Daniel's face lasted only a moment before he noticed Evelyn quietly wiping away tears she could no longer hide. She was not crying because of the storm or the long walk or even the fear she had carried all day. She was crying because a warehouse employee who could barely afford dinner had opened his home without hesitation. A pharmacist had bent as far as the rules would allow to protect a child he had never met. And an entire city she thought she understood suddenly looked completely different through eyes that no longer measured success in quarterly reports, but in ordinary people who chose compassion when nobody expected them to. The apartment felt warmer when they returned from the pharmacy, but the night had changed its meaning. Daniel helped Sophie out of her coat, watched her take one more careful breath, and settled her beneath a blanket on the couch with the stuffed bear Rachel had given her years ago. He stayed beside her until the tightness in her chest eased and her breathing found a steady rhythm. Only then did he stand. Evelyn watched him carry the empty inhaler to the kitchen counter and place it beside the white pharmacy bag with the same care he used for everything connected to his daughter. For the third time that night, she nearly told him the truth. She imagined saying her full name, making one call, sending a car, replacing every unpaid bill on the counter with certainty. But the thought stopped her. Daniel had not shared his meal, his time, or his home because he believed she could repay him. If she revealed herself now, the world might later reduce his kindness to a fortunate investment. She could not allow the purest thing she had witnessed all day to be rewritten as strategy. Daniel filled the kettle and glanced toward her. "Tea?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "Thank you." He spoke as though the pharmacy had not just forced him to count $20 bills while his child struggled to breathe. There was no performance in his composure. He was simply moving to the next responsibility. Across the city, Grant Caldwell stood beneath the cold white lights of Whitmore Foods headquarters while Evelyn's security team repeated the same answer. They had lost visual contact during the storm. Grant dismissed them and closed the conference room door. On the screen before him waited a presentation titled Interim Governance Response. He changed the wording on the first slide from emergency concern to leadership instability. The difference was subtle, but important. He did not intend to accuse Evelyn of recklessness. He intended to let the board arrive at that conclusion themselves. He selected operational risk reports, delayed acquisition figures, and unanswered messages from major investors. Each fact was real. Together, arranged carefully, they told the story he needed. By sunrise, he would recommend a temporary transfer of executive authority until Evelyn could demonstrate that personal judgment no longer threatened the company. It would sound responsible. It would protect shareholders. It would also place every major decision, including the warehouse consolidation plan, under his control. Back in apartment 2B, Daniel sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table. Sophie slept. Only a few feet away, one hand resting near the new inhaler. "You asked earlier whether one person can change a company," Daniel said quietly. "I think they can, but only if they are willing to hear what the system is trying to hide from them." Evelyn looked toward the Whitmore Foods jacket hanging by the door. "And what does a system hide?" "Usually the cost," he replied. "Not the dollar cost. The human one." His answer nearly broke her resolve. Her hand moved toward the inside lining of her gray coat, where a thin leather card holder rested against the seam. Inside it was a private business card bearing her full name and a number answered at any hour by someone who could reach the board, security, legal counsel, and every senior executive in the company. Her fingers touched the edge of the card. One call could stop Grant before morning. One sentence could protect Daniel's job. She withdrew her hand. Not yet. If she acted now, she would be escaping the final hours of the very truth she had chosen to face. Daniel noticed only that she seemed cold and pushed his untouched mug closer to her side of the table. "Take mine," he said. "I can make another." Evelyn looked at the steam rising between them. He was still giving. Even now. Somewhere downtown, Grant added the Southside Distribution Center to a list marked immediate consolidation candidates. He paused over the file containing employee impact projections, then moved it into an appendix he doubted most board members would open. He was not a man who believed himself cruel. He believed survival belonged to leaders willing to make decisions others avoided. That belief made him dangerous because it allowed every ambition to wear the language of necessity. In the apartment, Daniel unfolded the sofa bed and placed a clean blanket across it. "You should rest," he said. "Morning will make everything clearer." Evelyn almost laughed at the painful truth of it. Morning would make everything visible. She thanked him and waited until he disappeared into the bedroom with Sophie. The apartment settled into silence. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes knocked somewhere inside the wall. Snow continued falling beyond the window, softening the streets while Grant sharpened his argument across the city. Evelyn sat on the edge of the sofa bed and removed the business card at last. She placed it on the table but did not turn it over. The private number remained hidden against the wood. She stared at it for a long time, knowing it was both an escape and a promise. Before dawn, she would decide how to use it. Not to reward Daniel. Not to rescue herself from discomfort. Not to erase one painful night with money. She would use it to expose what distance had allowed her company to become. Evelyn remained awake as the snow covered Chicago, thinking of the diner, the full shelters, Harold beneath the laundromat awning, Sophie's empty inhaler, and Daniel's steady voice reminding her that every decision began with one person. As the first pale light approached the horizon, she made a silent promise that when morning came, she would not change one policy, one warehouse, or one executive. She would change Whitmore Foods from the ground up. Morning entered apartment 2B as a pale ribbon of light across the kitchen floor. Daniel was already dressed for work, His faded Whitmore Foods jacket zipped halfway as he poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. Evelyn stood near the window holding the blue striped gloves Sophie had lent her. In daylight, Daniel noticed details he had overlooked during the storm. The way she studied the company logo as though it belonged to her, the precision with which she had discussed refrigerated loads, the gold ring hidden inside a coat that looked borrowed, and the private business card resting face down on the table. "You never worked beside someone in distribution," he said quietly. Evelyn met his eyes. Daniel continued, not accusing her, only assembling the truth. "You knew our dock procedures. You recognized Grant Caldwell's review language. And when we passed that Whitmore store, you looked at the sign like it had disappointed you personally." Evelyn slowly turned over the card. Daniel read the name once, then again. Evelyn Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer. The silence that followed was not admiration. It was distance returning to a room where, for one night, no distance had existed. "You own the company," Daniel said. "I lead it," Evelyn answered. "Last night showed me those are not always the same thing." Sophie entered rubbing her eyes and wrapped both arms around Daniel's waist. When Evelyn knelt to return the gloves, Sophie pushed them gently back. "Keep them until you are warm," she said. Evelyn's voice trembled. "I think I finally am." A black sedan arrived minutes later, but Evelyn did not leave for headquarters. She asked Daniel to come with her to the Southside warehouse, not as the man who had fed her, but as the employee whose knowledge she had failed to see. By mid-morning, workers gathered between loading bays, whispering as Evelyn entered wearing the same gray coat. Some looked hopeful. Others folded their arms, unwilling to trust another executive speech. Grant Caldwell stood near the front with a folder prepared for the board. When Evelyn announced an independent investigation into the proposed closure, Grant did not deny supporting it. "The facility is aging," he argued evenly. "Transportation costs are rising. 2 nearby centers have unused capacity, and shareholders expect us to protect the company before a downturn forces harsher cuts. Consolidation could preserve more jobs than delay." Several employees exchanged uneasy glances because his argument sounded reasonable. Evelyn nodded. "That is why there will be an investigation, not a public execution. But the review will include the impact projections removed from the main report, the assumptions behind the savings estimates, and testimony from the people who operate this system." Grant's expression tightened, but she did not dismiss him. He would remain on administrative leave while an outside firm examined the evidence. Then Evelyn asked Daniel to explain the routing method he had developed during the previous winter. Reluctantly, he described how early temperature tracking, flexible dock windows, split regional loads, and a refrigerated buffer trailer had reduced waste and overtime without cutting service. Warehouse supervisors confirmed that his approach had worked for 6 weeks before regional management absorbed the results without crediting him. Evelyn turned toward the employees. "Daniel Brooks is not standing here because he shared a sandwich with me. He is standing here because he understands this operation, earns trust without demanding it, and sees consequences before they become numbers." She invited him to join a permanent frontline advisory council with paid meeting hours and direct access to operational reviews. Daniel accepted only after confirming that other members would be selected for knowledge, not titles. The investigation later preserved the warehouse by adopting Daniel's routing model across 3 districts, while Grant's consolidation proposal was revised rather than erased. The deeper change came through the last table, a system that redirected safe, unsold meals from Whitmore food stores to neighborhood partners each evening. Its first recipients were a mother named Carla and her 2 sons, who had been living in a motel after a medical leave cost her their apartment. At the diner, they were not handed a charity box at the back door. They were seated, offered menus, and allowed to choose dinner like every other family. Harold welcomed them as the program's first community advisor, and Daniel made sure no child had to explain why they were hungry. Months later, on Rachel's birthday, Daniel and Sophie returned to the diner with Evelyn. There were no cameras and no announcement. They ordered tomato soup, 1 chicken sandwich, coffee, and hot chocolate. When another tired traveler entered from the cold, Sophie divided the sandwich and placed the larger half on a clean napkin at the center of the table. Evelyn asked who it was for. Sophie looked toward Rachel's empty place in the old family photograph Daniel carried in his wallet, then toward the stranger waiting near the door. For whoever needs to know they still belong somewhere, she said. Daniel opened the empty chair beside them. Evelyn watched the traveler approach, understanding at last that justice was not a fortune delivered to one good man. It was a table made wider, a system taught to remember faces, and a child growing up certain that kindness did not make her father weak. It revealed the strength he had carried all along.